I still remember the look on his face because it wasn't anger. It wasn't embarrassment. It was confidence. The kind of confidence people get when they honestly believe nobody can ever prove what they've been doing. He leaned against his front door with his arms crossed, smiled like we were sharing some private joke, and said, "Then prove it." What he didn't know was that I'd been collecting proof every single morning for over a year without even trying, and by the time he finished that sentence, his own insurance company was already about to become my strongest witness. My name is Ethan Brooks, and until all of this happened, I would have told you I was one of those neighbors who avoided drama at all costs. My wife, Claire, always joked that I'd apologize if somebody backed into my truck because I hated confrontation that much. We lived in a quiet subdivision outside Knoxville, Tennessee, one of those neighborhoods where people wave from their porches, kids ride bicycles until sunset, and everyone pretends everything is perfect even when it clearly isn't. We had moved there about 4 years earlier after our youngest left for college. It was supposed to be the peaceful chapter of our lives. We planted flowers, rebuilt the back deck, bought rocking chairs for the front porch, and settled into routines that made every day feel comfortable. Then Caleb Mercer bought the house next door. At first, he seemed friendly enough. Big smile, loud laugh, always talking about the fishing trips he planned with his 18-foot bass boat. I even helped him unload furniture on moving day. Looking back now, I guess first impressions really don't tell you much. The first couple of weeks were fine, but then I started noticing something strange every morning around 6:30. Instead of backing his boat out of his own driveway, Caleb would swing the trailer wide across mine. Not just close to it, actually into it. His truck and trailer would sit there for several minutes while he adjusted straps, checked lights, tied down coolers, and got everything ready for the lake. The first time, I figured he just needed extra room. The second time, I thought maybe he was still learning the angles. By the 10th time, I realized he simply didn't care. It had become part of his routine. My driveway was easier to use, so he used it. One Saturday morning, I walked outside holding a coffee mug and said, "Hey Caleb, would you mind keeping the trailer on your side? Claire leaves for work early and she's almost been blocked in twice." He barely looked up from the boat. "Sure thing," he answered with a grin. "Life won't happen again." The next morning, his trailer was sitting in my driveway before sunrise. Claire looked at me through the kitchen window and just raised one eyebrow. We both laughed because sometimes laughing is easier than starting an argument. A week later, I asked again, a little more directly this time. "I'm serious, man. Please stay off my driveway." He shrugged. "Relax. It's concrete. It isn't going to wear out." That answer bothered me more than I expected. It wasn't about the concrete. It was about respect. People who respect boundaries don't need long explanations. They simply stop crossing them. But Caleb acted like every request was an inconvenience to him. Then came the first scrape. I heard the sound before I saw it. A dull metallic crunch that instantly makes every car owner cringe. His trailer fender clipped the edge of my driver's door while he was making another unnecessarily wide turn. He climbed out, glanced at the mark, rubbed it with his thumb like that somehow erased reality, then drove away without knocking on my door. I found the dent 20 minutes later. I wanted to believe it was an accident. I even convinced myself maybe he hadn't noticed. So instead of calling him angry, I walked over that evening and calmly explained what had happened. He frowned, looked at the damage for about 3 seconds, then said, "Couldn't have been me. I wasn't looking for a fight. I just wanted him to acknowledge it and maybe offer to split the repair." Instead, he acted annoyed that I'd interrupted his dinner. I paid for a paint correction myself because I figured preserving peace was worth a few $100s. 3 weeks passed. Life settled down again. Until another Monday morning when I heard that same awful scraping noise. This time, the trailer corner dug deeper into the rear quarter panel. I stepped outside fast enough to see him pulling away. He looked directly at me through his side mirror. We made eye contact. He kept driving. Claire sighed when I showed her the fresh damage. "You're giving this guy way too much grace," she said quietly. Maybe she was right. Maybe I kept assuming people eventually did the right thing, because that's what I would have done. Then came strike number 3. It happened on a rainy Thursday. The boat shifted slightly while he turned. The protective canvas rubbed the entire length of my driver's side, leaving one long, ugly scratch from front fender to taillight. Standing there in the drizzle, staring at that silver line across my truck, I finally admitted something I'd been avoiding for months. This wasn't bad luck anymore. This was habit. That afternoon, I collected 3 repair estimates totaling just over $2,300, slipped them into a folder, walked across the lawn, knocked on Caleb's front door, and honestly believed we were finally going to settle everything like adults. Instead, he leaned against the doorway with a smirk that still makes me laugh today for completely different reasons, glanced at the paperwork without touching it, and said, "How do you even know my boat did that? Prove it." Then he chuckled, wished me a nice evening, and slowly closed the door in my face. And as I stood there holding those repair estimates, I realized he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. I walked back across my lawn carrying that folder under my arm, and somewhere between his porch and my garage, my frustration turned into something a whole lot calmer, almost peaceful. People think revenge starts with yelling or slamming doors. It doesn't. Sometimes it starts with silence. I set the repair estimates on my workbench, grabbed a bottle of water, sat down in the garage, and stared at my truck for a long minute before something clicked in my head. About a year earlier, we'd installed a Ring camera after a package disappeared from the porch. I honestly hadn't thought much about it since. It just sat there over the garage, recording motion every day, quietly doing its job while life happened underneath it. I opened the app, almost absent-mindedly, and scrolled backward through the timeline. There was Caleb's truck. There was the boat. There was my driveway. I kept scrolling farther. Another morning, another one. Every single weekday looked almost identical. His truck would swing wide into my driveway. He'd stop to tighten straps or check the trailer lights. Then he'd pull away toward the lake. My heart started beating faster, not because I was angry anymore, but because I realized this wasn't just evidence of 3 accidents. It was a complete history of his behavior. I poured another cup of coffee, connected my laptop to the dining room television, and started downloading clips. Claire came home from work around 5:30, dropped her purse on the kitchen island, looked at the screen full of security footage, and asked, "What exactly are you doing?" I smiled for the first time all week. "Homework," she laughed. "That usually means somebody else is about to fail the test." By midnight, we had watched months of recordings together. We found the first scrape, then the second, then the third. We also found something I hadn't expected. Caleb had entered my driveway 23 different times with that trailer. Not 3, 23. Most mornings, nothing happened except trespassing onto private property, but every single visit was timestamped down to the second. His truck license plate was readable. The trailer registration numbers were crystal clear. Every motion event was automatically stored in the cloud. Every file carried its own date and time. It was like someone had quietly built a perfect archive while I wasn't paying attention. Claire looked over at me and said, "He really told you to prove it?" I nodded. "Well," she smiled, "I think you're about to." The next evening, I organized everything into folders by date. Every clip received a label. Every incident got screenshots from multiple angles. I matched each repair estimate with the exact frame showing contact between the trailer and my truck. By the time I finished, the entire case looked less like a neighbor dispute and more like evidence prepared for court. The following morning, I visited the local police department. I wasn't asking anyone to arrest Caleb. I simply wanted an official property damage report on file. Officer Daniel Ruiz invited me into a small interview room, plugged my USB drive into his computer, and watched the first video without saying much. On the second clip, he leaned closer to the screen. By the third one, he paused the video himself. "Is that the same trailer every time?" he asked. "Every single time," I answered. He replayed the frame showing the trailer fender scraping my driver's door. "You can clearly see contact." Then he watched another clip where Caleb looked directly toward my house after striking the vehicle before driving away. Officer Ruiz slowly leaned back in his chair. "Well, this isn't exactly complicated." He filed the report before I even left the station. Walking back to my truck, I realized something important. Caleb had assumed I needed witnesses. He assumed I needed neighbors willing to testify. He assumed memory was unreliable. What he forgot was that cameras don't get emotional. They don't exaggerate, and they don't forget. From there, everything moved surprisingly fast. I opened a claim with my insurance company and uploaded every piece of evidence they requested. 2 days later, an adjuster named Melissa called me. She spent nearly 40 minutes reviewing the timeline. At one point, she actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because she'd rarely seen evidence organized so thoroughly. "Mr. Barshall Brooks," she said, "I've handled hundreds of vehicle claims. I wish every customer documented incidents like this." She explained that after paying for my repairs, they would pursue reimbursement directly from Caleb's homeowner's insurance through subrogation. That meant the fight was no longer just between neighbors. Now, 2 insurance companies would be involved, And unlike people trying to avoid awkward conversations across backyard fences, insurance investigators care about one thing: evidence. But I wasn't finished. That night, I kept thinking about something I'd overheard months earlier during a neighborhood barbecue. One of our older neighbors had joked that trailers weren't supposed to be parked on someone else's residential driveway because the city had specific zoning rules about recreational watercraft. At the time, nobody paid much attention. Now I wondered if there was actually something to it. I spent an hour reading municipal ordinances online. Buried inside the city code, I found exactly what I remembered. A trailer recreational watercraft couldn't be stored or repeatedly staged on residential property where it wasn't registered or permitted. Repeated violations could be cited individually when documented. I read that paragraph 3 times just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding it. Then I smiled. The next morning, I contacted code compliance. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't demand punishment. I simply explained the situation and asked whether time-stamped video qualified as documentation. The inspector on the phone asked me to email several sample clips. I sent 6. She called back before lunch. "Mr. Brooks, can you provide the rest? How many do you need?" There was a short pause. All of them. 2 inspectors visited my house that Friday afternoon. They sat at my dining room table while my laptop played clip after clip after clip. One inspector occasionally paused the footage to zoom in on license plates or timestamps. The other quietly wrote notes. At one point, the older inspector looked up at me and said, "You've kept this very organized." I shrugged. "Actually, your camera did." He laughed harder than I expected. They spent nearly 2 hours reviewing the archive before thanking me and leaving. Across the street, I noticed Caleb washing his boat, completely unaware of what had just happened 20 yards away. For another week, nothing seemed to change. Caleb still waved sarcastically whenever he saw me outside. He still acted like the conversation on his porch had ended the whole dispute. Then one Tuesday morning, a white city pickup stopped in front of his house. An inspector walked to the front door carrying a clipboard. Caleb answered wearing flip-flops and a fishing shirt. Even from my porch, I could tell the conversation wasn't going well. His hands started moving. The inspector remained perfectly calm. 20 minutes later, another city vehicle arrived, and another. Claire walked out beside me holding 2 mugs of coffee. "Should we go inside?" she asked. "No," I said quietly. "I think this is where the story starts getting interesting." Over the next 10 days, official notices kept appearing in Caleb's mailbox, one after another. Certified envelopes, compliance letters, citation packets. I never opened a single one, of course, but I didn't have to. He started pacing his driveway with the phone pressed against his ear. The easy smile disappeared. The confidence disappeared. Even the boat stayed parked for almost a week. Then my insurance adjuster called again. "Good news," Melissa said. "The other carrier has reviewed the footage." I waited. She continued. "They've accepted liability." I thanked her, hung up, and looked out the kitchen window just as Caleb stepped outside to collect yet another envelope from his mailbox. For the first time since he'd moved in next door, he looked genuinely worried. And I had a feeling he was only beginning to understand what 2 simple words had really cost him when he smiled and said, "Prove it." 3 days after my insurance adjuster called, everything finally came together. I was pulling weeds along the front walkway when a dark sedan stopped outside Caleb's house. A man in a navy suit stepped out carrying a leather briefcase, followed by another woman with a tablet in her hand. They weren't friends. They weren't family. They were insurance investigators. They spent almost an hour inside. When they finally left, Caleb walked them to the driveway with his shoulders slumped, nothing like the guy who had laughed in my face a couple of weeks earlier. That same afternoon, my phone rang again. Melissa sounded almost cheerful. "Mr. Brooks, your repairs have been approved in full. We'll take care of the payment directly with the body shop, and we'll continue recovering the costs for Mr. Mercer's policy." I thanked her, but before hanging up, I asked the question I already knew the answer to. "His premiums are probably going up, aren't they?" She chuckled politely. "Let's just say insurance companies don't usually reward repeated documented negligence." About a week later, another letter arrived for Caleb, only this one came from the city. I found out what it contained because he marched across my lawn carrying the envelope, red-faced and furious. "Did you report me?" he demanded before I even said hello. I looked at him for a second, then answered honestly. "I reported what happened." He waved the paperwork in the air. "They're saying I violated City Code 23 different times." "Did you?" I asked quietly. He opened his mouth, stopped, then tried another angle. This is ridiculous. Nobody keeps track of stuff like that. I couldn't help smiling. Actually, my camera did. For a moment, he just stared at me. I watched him mentally replay every morning he'd ever cut across my driveway. Every time he'd ignored my requests. Every smirk. Every sarcastic comment. It was almost like I could see the realization settling in. He wasn't arguing with me anymore. He was arguing with months of recorded history. 2 days later, his attorney called. The conversation was surprisingly polite. He explained that his client wanted to resolve everything without additional legal action. I listened without interrupting until he finally asked whether I would consider withdrawing my complaints with the city. I told him I wasn't interested in making anyone's life miserable. That had never been my goal. I simply wanted accountability. Then I laid out 3 conditions. First, Caleb would reimburse every dollar of the vehicle damage that wasn't already covered during the insurance process. Second, he would sign a legally binding agreement stating that neither he nor anyone using his property would enter my driveway without permission for the next 3 years. Third, I wanted a written apology. Not because I needed an apology to feel better, but because I wanted him to acknowledge what this entire mess had really been about: respect. The attorney became very quiet before saying, "I think those terms are reasonable." 4 days later, we met in a conference room downtown. Caleb looked exhausted. He signed every document without making eye contact. When the attorney slid the apology letter across the table, I read it carefully. It admitted responsibility for the property damage. It acknowledged that my repeated requests had been ignored. It apologized for dismissing my concerns and challenging me to prove something he already knew had happened. I folded the letter, placed it back inside the envelope, stood up, shook the attorney's hand, nodded politely to Caleb, and walked out. There wasn't some dramatic speech. There didn't need to be. Sometimes silence says more than winning an argument ever could. Over the following months, our neighborhood slowly returned to normal. Caleb never used my driveway again. In fact, he became almost overly careful whenever he backed that boat out. He measured every turn twice. Sometimes I'd see him stop, get out of the truck, and physically check the trailer clearance before moving another inch. Claire joked that he'd become the safest trailer driver in Tennessee. We laughed, but there was truth in it. The funny part is that none of this had anything to do with boats, insurance claims, or city ordinances. Those were just consequences. The real story was about what happens when someone mistakes kindness for weakness. I give Caleb chance after chance because I believe neighbors should solve problems by talking to each other. He mistook patience for surrender. He believed confidence could replace evidence. Then he challenged the one thing that actually existed: the truth. Every morning he thought nobody was watching. Every morning a little camera quietly recorded exactly what happened without emotion, without bias, without forgetting a single detail. If he'd simply apologized after the first scrape, I probably would have accepted a handshake and moved on. Instead, 2 words changed everything. Prove it. Looking back now, I don't feel victorious. I feel relieved. Relieved that I trusted facts instead of anger. Relieved that I stayed calm when it would have been easy to lose my temper. Most of all, relieved that I learned something worth remembering. In today's world, evidence speaks louder than arguments ever will. So now I'm curious. If you were in my position, would you have accepted his apology and settled the way I did? Or would you have taken the case all the way through court? Let me know down in the comments, because I genuinely want to hear where you draw the line between giving someone another chance and making sure they finally face the consequences of their own choices. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who's ever been told you can't prove it, only to discover that sometimes the truth has been quietly recording the whole time.